All right, so is it going?
The record button?
Yeah, it's recording. Okay, so welcome everybody. This is the first class in our 6-part learning series on the economics of sustainability with Dr. Madhavi Venkatesan. And I'm Corey Fahrenkoff. I'm the Assistant Director of Sturgis Library here with Gabrielle Griffiths, who is my wife, but we're also in the Blue Marble Librarians together. She's got a few things to tell you about the Blue Marble Librarians before we get rolling with our main event tonight. So, Gabrielle.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this meeting. The Blue Marble Librarians are a group of librarians that work together on issues related to climate change. And that includes initiatives such as this one, as well as Climate Preparedness Week, which is an initiative of communities responding to extreme weather, but it's co-sponsored by the Massachusetts library system. And so we are really thrilled to have been able to work with Madhavi on this, as well as she was a speaker for Climate Prep Week. If you're interested in learning more about Climate Prep Week, you can learn more at the Massachusetts Library System's website. And we also have some social media you can follow as well under the Blue Marble Librarians. This is going to be the first of 6 learning series, and we wanted to just overview them for you, and we hope that you come back each week as we explore and discuss the economics of sustainability. The first one tonight, we're going to be discussing defining an economic system, a discussion of social construction. Next week, we'll be talking about the role of GDP and culture. On January 22nd, there will be a discussion on theory and reality, the role of economic agents in consumption and production. On January 29th, we'll be talking about aligning sustainability with the present economic system. On February 5th, we'll be discussing reconfiguring the economy from the bottom up. And the last in the series is going to be why explicit discussions of values is important, necessary, significant in defining an economy. Tonight, Madhavi is going to be talking for about 30 minutes, and then after we're going to open it up to a discussion, and that will be about 30 minutes. And we would ask that you put your questions into the chat. We may decide to change our interactive format for the discussion later on, but we wanted to try it out tonight and see how it goes. That being said, we want to introduce Madhavi now.
And I'll be doing the introducing. Yeah.
Yes.
So Dr. Madhavi Venkatesan is the founder and executive director of Sustainable Practices. She earned her PhD, MA, and BA in economics from Vanderbilt University, a master's in sustainability and environmental management from Harvard University, and a master's in environmental law and policy from Vermont Law School. She's a recipient of a Fulbright Distinguished Lectureship. She is an author and activist, and she is also professor of economics at Northeastern University. So without further ado, let's all welcome Dr. Venkatesan and silently clap because you're all muted. So welcome.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you so much for organizing this with Sustainable Practices, Gabrielle and Corey. I appreciate it more than you know. It's very important, in our opinion, especially speaking from my role at Sustainable Practices, to really try to encourage sustainability by discussing the questions that often come up as to why it can't work. And so I'm hoping that over the next 6 weeks, we will be able to explore why it can work and why perhaps maybe, as we're going to discuss today, a lot of it has a lot more to do with our perceptions of how society has been established. So we'll spend a little time discussing some of my thoughts on this, but I really encourage more to hear from you because I think when we have an active dialogue, it actually helps us to reinforce or to adopt new ways of thinking, and that works both ways. So with regard to today and just my background a little bit more, just to let you know, I came back to academics in 2014. I had been in the private sector for some time. So I was an investor relations officer. I represented 3 global companies, Unum Provident, AIG, and the Hartford Financial Services Group, all during their respective crises, the financial crises for the latter 2, and the first, their individual crisis. So it's during that time period that I actually started to think about corporate social responsibility, and the light bulb went off on my head because I'd gotten my PhD in 1996, that really economics is at the basis of all of this. What we see in terms of the issues that surround us in our economy are really the endogeneity, or the building into society of the theory that we teach. And the theory is just that, because by its definition, it doesn't necessarily mean fact, although in our particular case, we probably will see as we continue our discussion, that theory has actually become fact just because of the way in which it's marketed to us. So I'm hoping that we'll all find this somewhat interesting, and I'm going to look to you to give me feedback, please. Zoom is quite challenging from the standpoint that we are literally just looking at each other, but we can't even hear each other breathe. So the silence can be somewhat hard to deal with when you're speaking to an audience. So the first thing I just want to talk about is this concept of economics. And I see, I looked at the room and I saw Kayla. So I know Kayla has already seen this because she's been with me in a class that I'm teaching this summer. So hopefully it won't be too redundant for you. But oftentimes people believe that they understand what economics is, but when it's used in the vernacular, it typically is addressing financial returns. And economics is not about financial returns. Financial returns basically are a proxy for the underlying basis of economics, which economics is about well-being and about maintaining a well-functioning home in terms of its original meaning. So I wanted to talk about initially in our discussion, the social construction around our perception of economics and the role of economics and culture, because the other aspect, which I spend a lot of time thinking about, is the language, because when we really think about why we believe what we believe, it's because of the legitimacy that language conveys for certain words. And in our Western perspective, we have been sort of told in an indirect way that everything naturally evolves. We've just sort of bought into this idea that the reason why things are is because of a natural evolution, survival of the fittest. But with human institutions, the survival of the fittest is fundamentally more a relationship of power than it is necessarily evolution in the sense of what is perhaps the best interest of all. So we really need to think about that and hopefully reclaim our power as we do just become more cognizant of that. And then the last part is just to talk about religion and economics and this whole concept of morality. I got trapped myself. I would often talk about the need to include morality into the economic system, specifically the demand function. But the reality is there are multiple definitions of the concept of morality, just like there are multiple definitions of this concept of education. So we have to be very clear when we use words that we're conveying our meaning, because economics is moral. It's just moral in a very utility focused way. So we apply our morality as it applies to our benefit, and we basically divest ourselves of a moral interest when it doesn't. So a simple example of this would be, in my opinion, how we look at animals. If I'm going to oversimplify and say there are three categories of animals: pets, animals that we use for commercial purposes, and then animals that you use for hunting purposes, so sport. If you look and see the level of protections animals get, they're all based on the human perspective of the use value of that animal. So our moral responsibility is totally engaged to use value. So the dog, the pet, has regulation that protects its life. The commercialized animal has regulation that protects its death, that the quality of its meat product, it meets needs, but it's not protected in its life. And the same thing is true for the animal for sport. The protection of its habitat isn't important. It's just in terms of the trophy, who can claim the kill. So it's interesting when we start to think about this, but there are other aspects of religion, I think, that are also important. And I'm going to jump ahead just for a second and just say the part of religion that matters to me the most when I talk about economics today is we are in the rise of the nones, N-O-N-E-S. So more and more people claim not to be part of a religious denomination today. But that also means that people are not necessarily having the same kind of consistent values that are generated from having a homogeneous religion in a country. So as long as values are not secularly being promoted as a singular secular sense of morality within a nation, you have a heterogeneity or a very different set of morals depending upon where you are, who you're interacting with. And to a large extent, one could say that lack of uniformity and national values that are not put in place to substitute in place of a lack of religious values, may be also part and parcel of the problems that we see with regard to the way we run our economic system. Because we don't have an inherent sense of guilt. We have a separation, unfortunately, between the value parameters that we live by and the way that we interact in terms of the market structure. So let me just go quickly through a couple of slides. So what is economics? This is coming directly from the American Economic Association website, because I'm looking for legitimacy. And like I brought up before, words are so important. The legitimacy that we give the words determines the value we take of the words, right? So the American Economic Association, being the primary association for economics in the United States, gives this definition some legitimacy. So most people believe that economics is about money. When you poll people, that's the first thing that they say. I often ask classes where the class is interdisciplinary. What is economics? And money usually comes up, but economics is about well-being. And it's also a way of being a forgive me, for looking into the future and forecasting the future, because inherently humans we're scared of the uncertainty of our lives. So in some way, shape, or form, economics does have an ability to impose a structure and also reduce that uncertainty by the imposition of the structure. It does, and we'll see that a little bit more in a few weeks, but we can even talk about it today. So there are two concepts or two schools of thought when it comes to economics. I shouldn't even say schools of thought. Two different ways of seeing economic structures. One is microeconomics and one is macroeconomics. But the one thing we have to remember is up until the 1930s, everything was microeconomics. Macroeconomics gives us a big picture view. It gives us an ability to see where maybe the alarm is going off in a house, but really to go and fix where the alarm is going off, you need to go to the room and see what's going on in there, right? Microeconomics provides the context, and that's really the most important aspect of solving any kind of problem. Most of the policy problems that we have today in terms of policy not working or not meeting its mandate is because it works in the world of averages and what is generally true. It looks at where the alarm is going off, but it doesn't necessarily go and investigate what's causing it. So you really need a combination of both macroeconomics and microeconomics. And more than that, you also need an understanding of context, both cross-sectional, which means at this point in time, as well as longitudinal, what's happened in history to establish that context. And it's that lack of historical knowledge oftentimes that causes also wrong policy decisions. So I'm just going to bring up a few quotes that I thought we could talk about, and just to show you that, you know, these people that you're very familiar with in terms of their names would not necessarily have advocated for the structure that we have today. The really secular structure where our sense of value has been directly exited from the way in which we interact with one another in a business or market realm. So in terms of Keynes, and we're going to talk about virtue and vice, it's one of my favorite areas to discuss, and I hope that it will be something that you'll find interesting as well. So in the Keynes quote, it says right here, return to some or of the most sure and certain principles, and forgive me right now that my screen is of religion and traditional virtue, that avarice is a vice and that exaction of usury is a misdemeanor and the love of money is detestable. So we're going to talk specifically about where the virtue exit our economic system and how can we bring it back. That's really, when we talk about sustainability, that's what we're really talking about. When did conscience and our sense of absolute moral obligation to one another exit? And in the fact that we can just remember that it actually was a part of, we know that it's not natural or necessarily, as somebody wrote in a comment to me today, in our DNA to necessarily be aggressive. So I'm leaving these up here for you to read while I speak, so I'm not necessarily going to speak to them. But again, right here with the second quote, it's meant to open up the door in discussion that this whole idea of progress as we measure it isn't necessarily what really promotes our well-being. So as we look at the social construction of where we are, we really need to also consider why we are where we are. So hopefully we will continue to do that. Schumacher, who wrote, some of you may know, Small is Beautiful, that's a book that I'd really highly recommend. It's available on the internet, so you don't have to necessarily buy it. It's just a small book. It's a very easy read. And Small is Beautiful is probably one of the few books out there that give you a comparative economic lens. So it is about Buddhist economics, or a way a Buddhist would evaluate an economic system. I'll give you a simple example. In his discussion, he talks about labor and leisure. And if you've taken an economics class, or even how you've been taught, or even how you've just absorbed things from just interacting with people, the primary preoccupation of people is to actually have greater leisure, to get away from work, because work is almost a chore that has to be done compared to the leisure time that they'd rather have. In the Buddhist perception, and that's discussed in Schumacher's book, the view is that one should love their work as much as they love their leisure. So they're intertwined. You don't lose any of your lifetime because you're at work. It is giving you the same amount of joy as when you're not specifically engaged in work. So it's a different way of thinking. I feel somewhat fortunate that I actually feel that way about what I do, and I hope that we can create a world where people feel that way too, because about everything that they do. Because when you love your work, or you love what you do at work, it affects your whole ability to interact even during the leisure times when you're not working. Everything sort of fits together. So the construction of thinking that leisure is more important than labor is something I think we need to think about too. This last quote right here, the reason why I'm bringing this up is, and the next slide will make it clear, is that if we think about the aspects of our economic system and the things that actually propel us forward, it's really related to promoting our consumption and promoting our insecurity. Anything that promotes our insecurity or a lack of feeling of self enables the marketing to come in to help us maybe buy something, get a date on a dating site, or some other type of good or service to alleviate this feeling of inadequacy that is actually put upon us by our system in order to promote consumption. And when we look at the 7 deadly sins and we think about our economic system, I think it becomes very obvious when we look at each one of these, how our economic system actually ties to or exacerbates or establishes these conditions. So I'll give you a moment to pause and just think about it yourself. Pride, envy, gluttony, lust, anger, greed, sloth. Are they not all promoted by our economic system, and they're legitimized by it? Not promoted and then people are told, no, that's not how to behave, but actually promoted and legitimized that this is how you should behave. So give you a thought in the back of your mind to think about that. And when you think about that, think back about what I just said about virtue versus vice. And those of us that are a little bit older can remember a time in this country where how you made your money was more important than how much money you made. That has changed quite a bit. And I would say it's changed quite a bit because we've been very focused on growth. So these are all side examples of a bigger picture example I want to bring to you in a moment. So part of the problem in terms of why we probably succumb to vice, why we don't question the social construction that actually promotes a less than desirable moral outcome, is because our educational system actually doesn't promote thinking or critical engagement, even though that's a buzzword today. Our educational system actually promotes limited thinking. And we're going to talk about this right now. And I'm also going to open up a question to you, and hopefully some of you might have some things that you'd wish to discuss on that issue too. So we have converging or diverging. Diverging would be much more consistent with critical thinking, and not necessarily one particular answer, that you can see multiple perspectives. In a converging system, you're actually promoting one way of thinking. And when you think about teaching for the test, when you think about the punitive nature of our educational system, students get points taken away for not knowing something, but they don't get the opportunity to get the points given back when they master it. That doesn't make any sense, does it? When you really think about it, it doesn't make any sense. If the goal is to learn for the sake of learning, it should be one where, unless somebody is a surgeon, and if they don't pass that test, they're going to potentially kill someone. So then I could see the need to have them perhaps take the exams over and over again. If it's a question of learning, a vehicle to learn, it doesn't seem necessary to penalize someone to the point where perhaps their future employment may be impacted. So in converging systems, we look at speed, accuracy, and logic. And some examples are multiple choice tests, things that are either right or wrong. So you see the world in black and white. And this is also true when we look at education, because we tend to see things in a linear fashion. We promote this perception that things happen linearly. And that's probably why also there's a natural desire to think that we've evolved to the situation that we're in. But life is spherical, as we all know. I mean, it's almost impossible to really start having a discussion on any topic without bringing up things that you probably haven't discussed yet, but will. And when we package it so simply, we give a false perception of how things work. And I think that's something else we need to think about as we're being change agents, which I hope that this will inspire. In divergent thinking, we're looking more at a critical engagement. Things are spontaneous, free-flowing, nonlinear. People are allowed to come up with different opinions. This doesn't mean that you have chaos. It just means that you have people thinking beyond what they just see in front of them, to understand the context, understand the interconnectivity, understanding that things are not in black and white terms. Life is lived in the shades of gray. And so this means that a multiple choice, you'd have a short answer or a short essay. You could be both sick and healthy. You know, there's parts of you that could have positive health benefits, and other parts that could not. So, and with this, I'm going to move on to just actually laying out some foundation with regard to the foundation of economic thought, the history of economic thought, the moral philosophical basis of economics. So economics is a moral philosophical discipline. And this is often forgotten. And I think when we look at some of these writings together, you'll see how important it is. So the Physiocrats are one aspect of our talk, not this particular day, but another day. I just wanted to introduce them, and I'll probably introduce them again that day. But the Physiocrats I have a tremendous affinity for, because they believed in small, localized economies. And the idea that I'm going to bring up to you right here is that they also believe the only real value was the produce from the earth, so our food. And that was the true measure of wealth, is what you can produce. That this whole idea of urbanization and development from that perspective yielded value for something that really didn't have anything to do with how you could live. So what are the few things that you need to live? We need 3 basic things to live. I often get food, clothing, and shelter. Only one of those is true. The first thing we need is air, oxygen. The second thing we need is water. And the third thing we need is food. But all those things are the things that we take least value in. And those are all the 3 things that we have polluted the most. And those are the things that I would say are probably the most necessary for our economic well-being, in terms of our well-being as happy, functional people. So hopefully we'll think about that, how our social structure, how our social construction of the reality that we live in have taken us so far away from the very basic things that we need to really be happy and healthy. So I'm not going to go through this slide, just put the name up there for the Physiocrats for you. I really just want to jump ahead to more Adam Smith. So people know of Adam Smith primarily from The Wealth of Nations. The Wealth of Nations is a second book. The first book he wrote was The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And the Theory of Moral Sentiments has a lot to do with providing a foundation for what he meant when he talked about certain things, such as the invisible hand and laissez-faire economics, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So Smith is guided by his religious belief. He's a deist. And at the time that he's writing, there is a lot of persecution with regard to beliefs, even in the Protestant church. So there are things to think about there, but we won't go into this discussion today. I want to just focus on his perceptions of God and our responsibilities, wealth, and accumulation, virtue versus vice. So this one I'm actually going to take the time to read because I think it's important. So God has endowed man with principles of nature that interest him in the welfare of others and that make their happiness necessary to him. Okay, what does this mean? So let me talk about this from the example that almost everyone has probably heard of, which is how people are guided by their own selfish interests. What he was referring to, and this comes out of this passage, that passage comes out of the Wealth of Nations, but its meaning is derived here. What he's referring to is that it is my desire to be loved by my customers. And my desire, my selfish desire to want to be loved by them means that I will produce the best product I can for them. Because in producing the best product I can for them, I will get their love because they will feel that quality that I put into making my product. So therefore, I will become a wealthy person because of the sentiment that I glean from my customers because of what I put into the quality of my work. The man down the street who's not doing as well in his business, who doesn't abide by the same perspective, instead looks to be as cheap as possible in his ingredients and do as little of a job that he can with regard to the product he creates, he'll be poor as a result. So wealth in and of itself is an indicator of my benevolence, my love. And it also shows the love that I have from others. That's what the meaning is here. And unfortunately, that's not necessarily how it's interpreted. So this is another passage. And what this passage is about from his perspective is that we all want to be liked and we all want to be part of the group. Now this runs in counter too, because what that means is if you are part of a group that may not necessarily be virtuous, because of your desire to be part of that group, you may find yourself turning from your own sense of what is morally right or wrong to just be part of that group. So it can go both ways. It doesn't mean that just because you want to be a part of a group, you're going to be perfect. But this is the second part of this. This is the part where it's relating to that you may do things that are in variation to what you really believe. Basically, God has endowed man with a natural desire to be the proper object of love and the dread of being the deserved object of hatred. So we want to be a part of that group, even if it doesn't necessarily tie to our own beliefs. I don't know if I put this here, but I'm going to stop and just say this right here. This is where the role of the impartial spectator also enters, though, in Adam Smith. You often hear people say, well, people were not moral in the past because that was just not an idea that they had. And that we need to evaluate the past based on what were their social norms back then. I disagree, and I believe that's also evidenced in what Smith writes, because when he talks about the impartial spectator, what he's basically saying is that all of us have the opportunity to stand back and look at the societies that we live in with the view or the lens of an impartial spectator, an observer, an objective person, and we can see very clearly by looking from that lens what we would consider to be right and wrong. So when we look at sustainability, all of us can see what can be right and wrong. But then we also, all of us, have a desire to be liked. We want to belong. But when you're looking at this has this juxtaposition of wanting to do what is right in a society that doesn't necessarily acknowledge the need to make the change. This is the quandary that people are in when they think of sustainability. And I'm hoping that over the course of the next couple of weeks, we can address that and empower each other a little bit more. Every generation's had this problem, and it is nothing unique. The question is that how much of us actually fall prey to the inertia of not wanting to be distant from the majority. So the next couple of slides basically say the exact same thing. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm emptying my screen, and I'm hoping that we can open it up to questions. And I'm pretty good on time. I did it for 30 minutes, which was my expectation. I have plenty of things to say. That is never a shortage for me. And I have the privilege of 3 days a week of having a stranded audience in front of me, but I don't want to strand you. So I would like to see if there are any comments before I maybe add a couple more things I could add. But I think it would be good to hear from you. So the goal really here today was to just bring up the idea of how our economy is a social construction. We'll be dealing with that more and more detail when we talk about GDP next week. I did this purposely to go sequentially because I didn't know the level of interest, and also didn't want to overwhelm by the fact that we have a heterogeneous audience, one particular viewpoint, which taking into consideration the interests that you may have. This to me is an extremely exciting and wonderful opportunity to try to create a homogeneity with regard to an understanding and perception of how the economic system affects sustainability, and how we can both affect the economic system and how the economic system itself is the solution to promote sustainability. So. Oh, yes, I'm seeing two sets of questions, Corey. So would you like to tell me which way should we go? Should we go to the chat, or should we go to the hands?
We could, which would you prefer? I think chat would probably work best, and maybe the way that I usually do it is I'll do the chat, and then when the questions come in, I can moderate and just ask them for you, and that way you don't have to worry about the chat. Does that work?
Okay, sure, no problem. I'll let you start then.
Yeah, all right. So the first question we got is coming in from Clara. They're asking, is it that easy to be an impartial spectator?
I don't think the ease or difficulty is how I would characterize it. I mean, we all have an ability to be the impartial spectators, whether we take the time. It's basically that divergent thinking, taking the time to watch, see, perceive what we see around us, and see from an empathetic lens, would it be something that we would want to be treated? Is that a way that we would want to be treated? Is that a way that really makes sense relative to the things that we believe in terms of kindness and compassion? So I really can't answer that question. It's a tough question because it's really individual specific.
The next one we got coming in is from Brian. He asks, I understand the attraction of adding a moral sense of economics in order to focus on sustainability, but is it necessary? Wouldn't it be sufficient to accurately ascribe value to external resources such as air and water and climate? Or do you think that only by adding morality to economics can this issue be addressed?
There are two sets of values. Our market system puts on a quantitative value on everything, the market value. And this is a great question that you brought up because it allows me to speak to one thing in just 1 second. The other part of the value structure are qualitative values. And the problem is that when we start to quantify things, we get limited based on our knowledge base of the interaction of a particular item or entity that we're looking at. And we're also limited by our human-centered perspective. And so those are the two aspects of just looking only at market mechanisms or quantitative mechanisms. So let me just explain that a little bit more. Theoretically, we all have heard about equilibrium prices. And equilibrium prices, by their definition, tell us that a fair price, it happens where supply and demand intersect, and that therefore you have a fair price. But that's not true. Prices are not fair. Prices are all based on who has a stronger level of exploitation. So a corporation operating in a poor and impoverished area can probably get some tax breaks and an ability to build their emissions promoting and factory there. The quantitative values have determined the use of that land and also the ability to pollute the qualitative factors are not taken into consideration. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a moral lens that you look at, because I agree with you, not everybody is going to necessarily be aligned to a moral lens. You have to figure out, depending upon what the stakeholder is, what is their alignment to the outcome that you want to see. Some people may be more aligned to thinking that let's line up all the qualitative and quantitative costs related to something and see whether, based on our risk tolerance and based on our desire to promote these particular outcomes, it makes sense to have this particular factory built here. So it's not necessarily a moral lens. I agree with you, that has to be addressed and adopted. It's a holistic lens, and a holistic lens that incorporates both qualitative and quantitative parameters, and most essentially the qualitative ones. But the other thing that needs to be changed is this one-stop shop kind of mentality towards putting policy in place. The moment you put a policy in place, you create a new dynamic system, which in and of itself affects the outcome or the intention of that policy. We need to be engaged in continuous improvement. So that means we continuously reevaluate to ensure the intention, which means that we have strategies in place that are independent of elections, that are based on a desire to promote a specific social welfare mission, a value that we have adopted as how we look at ourselves as a nation.
The next question we have coming in from Mallory. I appreciate the connection of our method of learning to how we take economics as truth. Can you speak to the actors in the system who intentionally sway our opinions, such as think tanks, etc.?
I believe that there are many entities out there that specifically write and discuss things to market their position. I mean, I too do that, right? Even speaking with you here, I am espousing my own normative perspective. I'm certainly not objective by any stretch of the imagination when I'm talking to you. I am trying to use my abilities to sway your opinion to believe what I believe. I think that it's really important that people take a multi-channeled approach with regard to their learning. So that really is a responsibility of the individual, especially today, more so than ever, because we have so many information channels. But it's also an issue today because of the very fact that we have so many information channels and we can opt out. So to some extent, it's actually being investigative yourself to find out what those channels are. But I think in a situation like what we're talking about here, it's just understanding the elementary elements can give you the ability to critically assess whether this think tank or another entity is saying something that makes sense, or are they saying it from a marketing perspective? If we start to take that critical engagement perspective and think that everyone is speaking for an intention, I think that will in and of itself help us to engage better with the information that we come into contact with.
The next question comes in from Jan. Sustainability considers the future, but the philosophies that you mentioned appear to focus on the present. What do you think of that?
The philosophies that I have brought up, Jan, and I'm so happy to see you, are related specifically to the foundation of economics. So my goal in actually bringing them up was to show the disconnect between how economics actually would have seen the world and the way that we actually evaluate the world. So today, to your point, today we do not actually have morality or moral judgment in the demand function. We don't go to the store and say, aha, we're not going to buy chocolate because chocolate represents a product that involves slave labor in the Congo, right? We don't go into the telephone store and say, aha, when these telephones are going to be wasted, which they have built-in obsolescence for, they're going to be toxic to our environment because they're made up of all these metals. We go ahead and buy it because it's in there in the store. We succumb to the marketed ability to demand. So that's one aspect that we have evolved from, because we've allowed the supplier to dictate our demand as opposed to us as a consumer to dictate what is supplied to us based on our values. So that one little element would have been hopefully one way of progression of our society, which we don't have. What we have instead is a supply and demand market system where the person has been taught in terms of economic theory, which is something we're going to talk about in a few weeks, that they have insatiable appetites to consume, and they have a desire to consume to the extent that their income allows them. In our case, in the United States, to the extent that our debt allows us. But that is in and of itself the reason for the disconnect. Because and the Saint Augustine quote that charity is no substitute for justice denied comes perfectly into being here. So our economic system actually promotes exploitation because the prices we pay are related to whoever is the more powerful entity, leading to an exploitation of the environment or other individuals, which then when we look over here, we say, oh, these people need charity because they can't compete in the system. It's not that they can't compete, it's that their very situation and vulnerability allows them to be exploited. And then we say, okay, we'll give them a little bit of our gains that we got over here because we knew how to play this market better. We'll give a little bit over here, not recognizing or even allowing ourselves to recognize that we are the reason for that. So the philosophies that I'm talking about specifically are related to trying to put back into the demand function, into our preferences, our responsibilities in terms of our conscience, our responsibilities in terms of the world that we want to see. And it is a much more difficult process because by our changing of our consumption, we have to go without. But that is the only way that we are going to be able to be the change. The power is not with us. To reclaim that power, we have to deny ourselves the interaction with the market. I hope that.
The next question comes from Kayla. I appreciate the explanation of the roots of the phrase people being guided by selfish nature. How could society further uplift the practice of putting in quality and shifting the focus to well-being rather than finances?
Well, this isn't going to happen universally, unfortunately. I mean, we all still teach people. And the first thing that we ask anybody, we can't help it, that happens everywhere you go, is what do you do? Now, do we ask that to see what the intellectual prowess of the individual is? Or do we ask that to gauge perhaps what their material status is? So it is, unfortunately, what's ended up happening, and Kayla, I appreciate this because I think you're referring to that proxy has become the goal discussion that we had in class, is that we used these financial proxies as a measure because they're easy to measure. They were supposed to be measurements that proxy for well-being, not necessarily well-being in and of itself. So what ended up happening, though, because they were so easy to measure, is that they become the goal in our society. So I think fundamentally, the only way that we can actually start to change this is to talk about it more. I don't think most people, and I think there's a lot of evidence that I don't have the surveys to actually show you today, but I only can say think because when we talk about statistics, we know they're all easily manipulated. There are plenty of surveys that do show that individual well-being hasn't necessarily increased with income or wealth formation. So people crave something more than that, but our society, because it's easier to measure income and quantitative factors, has unfortunately made that the default goal. So I would say fundamentally it's talking about it and also getting people to think about what really makes them happy. So giving people that moment to pause, which fortunately or unfortunately COVID has done for many, many people. It has forced us into that moment of pause. It has given us an opportunity to think about what really makes us happy, what's important for those of us that still derive an income and have that ability to sit back. For those of us that don't, it has taught something totally different. So it's not a universal outcome that COVID has had. But the other aspect of COVID is the loneliness, despair, boredom, which has also taught us that our educational system is perhaps not that good because it should have taught people how to be their own entertainment right here, rather than needing it from the outside in to have it from the inside to itself. I hope that helps.
And Kayla has a second part to that to add. Also, on another note, what is the best way to balance sustainability and well-being since supply chain tends to exploit people so much?
The most important thing, I think, if you're going to really, and I think this is an opportunity for anybody looking for entrepreneurship, is to maybe look at how you can create a supply chain that's transparent to help people make decisions that are more aligned to changing the world to what we want it to be. Some of the issues with the supply chain is the fact that of transparency, we can't really see it. and what we can't see, it's hard to make a decision on. But then there's also a cognitive dissonance aspect of it, that even when we can see it, we don't want to have to be discomforted with the change, so we refuse to believe it. So when we think about this, it really is going to be individual. Some of us are going to be more active with regard to changing our behavior related to that supply chain than others. But it doesn't take all of us to make a change. We need a tipping point. We need enough people who have enough power to make the changes. So investors coming together as activists, changing the fiduciary responsibility of corporate management teams' compensation. Individual consumers coming together and banning products. It's not every consumer that's going to do it, but the group, that small group that will lead that change, that will do it, will affect the world for all of us. So I think that's what we have to do, is also default back to that Margaret Mead quote. We don't have, never doubt that a small group of people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has.
The next one comes from Ella. Do you have any recommended reading on our economic system and the legitimization of 7 deadly sins? I consider our focus on economic growth to be akin to false idolatry. I'd like to think on it more. So recommended reading.
Well, there is an area of economics. I teach a class called Religious Influences in Economics, and it has 2 aspects, well, 3 aspects to it. One of the aspects is the fact that our secular economic system is a religion in and of itself. So that is one of the things that we're fighting. That's not institutionalized like a Christian religion would, that you have a church that you go to, but it has a religious component to it in the sense that you're either in it or you're not. And if you're not, no one cares about you. And when you're in it, there's a certain goal that you have, which is financial return. And you only have value as long as you continue to promote it. And there are other rules that also align to that. So when you start to think of it from that perspective, that economics is a religion, that's probably what you could potentially look into reading. And there are a few readings on that. And I'll be happy to send that with the email that will go out tomorrow.
Next one comes in from MJ. They say, that which gets measured gets done. We need to learn to measure and articulate different metrics. Any thoughts on that?
Yes. Measurement should be one element, but it's not sufficient. It is a necessary component, perhaps, in some cases, but not necessarily sufficient. Not everything has always been measured. People went by gut feelings, what was right and wrong, how it affected people, a gradient of a Likert scale before in terms of how we feel about things. This quantification that we live in is not a phenomena that occurred throughout human history. It's something that basically came into being maybe 50 years ago and entered into every social science discipline, and has changed the way we perceive credibility. In fact, every one of you probably knows that the statistical testing has so many flaws in it. And yet we give greater credibility when we actually see numbers behind things. Numbers are not objective. Numbers are subjective. They are subjective to the evaluator, the person who's writing the equation, the person who's determining what types of values they're going to put in. So it's great that we have some measurement tools, but without the context to actually assess those measurements that we get from a quantitative perspective, those measurements are highly manipulatable, excuse me. So we really need to think about them from a qualitative perspective as well.
Thank you. Next one comes in from Mallory. I think I'm going to pronounce part of this wrong. On the religion of economics, how much did neoliberalism / Mont Pelerin? Yeah, did I get it? Mallory, give me a thumbs up. Cool, there we go. Mont Pelerin society play into this?
Now, I can't answer the second part of this question because I'm not familiar enough. So Mont Pelerin society, I don't know. So that part I'm going to have to say, Mallory, I need a little bit of additional information from you. Okay, so I'll have to table that question.
I also don't know anything about it, so let alone pronunciation.
I received something from Paul. It came as a direct message to me. Shall I read it? Okay. Economics, the way you describe it, seems tied to direct doing something. Everyone has a role other than a mere consumer. Is that right? If so, how do you address the concern that automation and robotics may make some people feel like they are no longer needed? They only consume, but they do not produce better than can be done with machines. An economic system, and for us as individuals to have well-being, we do need to feel like we are part of society. The part of society that we feel like, though, doesn't necessarily have to be vocationally. If a person is retired and they aren't actually making an income, their job may be taken over by AI, but they're not making an income. They can still have plenty of activities that interconnect them to society and where they can promote value and have value. So it's a question of what you're talking about here. I'm not 100% sure if you're also referring to people who are displaced workers as a result of AI or capital, and then what happens to them. That's a very difficult question because we're still dealing with the issue of displaced workers from the steel industry, even though we're over 60 years into the future. The issue of what it does to the human psyche of not, especially if you're in a generation where the gender roles were very clearly defined in terms of who is the breadwinner, have affected that particular person indefinitely because they may not have been able to retrain to get another job. So in that particular case, if we actually thought as a society it had a social mission, which we don't, which is one area that I really promote. And I really think if we could start to think from that perspective, it could help us on so many levels. It should surely help us stop seeing our differences and seeing our common ground, because we'd have one set of mission that we are actually actively all partaking in. But what you bring up, Paul, is a big issue because, ideally what the government should have done is when you have a sector demise in a country, just like if a company was going to shut down one segment of its operations, it usually offers early retirement. The government should have been that vehicle to offer early retirement to these individuals, to give them an opportunity to either go ahead and move on to maybe some other potential occupation, or to move on to retirement if that was a natural trajectory for them. That failure is a failure of all of us. We have forgotten what a government really means. Government is there to ensure the distribution that would naturally occur if we were small local economies and we saw our neighbor having a hard time and we helped him. Well, we're no longer small local economies. We're this huge economy filled with anonymity, and the government is there to eliminate the anonymity, to look out for the welfare of each other. But instead, we define that as, I worked hard for my money, you didn't, so therefore why should you get the transfer payment? Not realizing that the lack of quality of life of our neighbor will affect us and the amount of hostility, depression, anxiety, and unhappiness that we live in as an overall society. That's why the qualitative parameters are so important, because it's only in accepting those qualitative parameters of well-being that we can really make the quantitative ones mean something.
Madhavi, I wanted to just, because we have about 5 minutes left, and I wanted to just offer a reading recommendation for everyone that ties into your talk. And, as we both work as librarians, and we're talking about, value and social construction. And the book is called Palaces for the People, How Social Infrastructure Can Help Fight Inequality, Polarization, and the Decline of Civic Life. This book is by Eric Kleinenberg. And one thing that I just wanted to posit as we wind down is that, one of the things that Eric Kleinenberg talks about is how integral this thing called social infrastructure is to our social well-being, to community well-being. And as we talk about economics, he talks about, volunteerism, he talks about different institutions, and ultimately, systems and organizations that are not designed for profit. And as a public servant and working as a public servant, I think a lot about this and how we have an infrastructure, we have a private sector, we have a public sector, right? And thinking about what do systems look like that are not designed for profit, but are rather designed, you know, like a library for social well-being, for social infrastructure. So I just wanted to, you know, put that recommendation out there for everybody, and then address the last questions before we finish for the night.
Yeah. Any positive library reading is good reading, right, everyone? We have a comment from Ken. I think this is touching back on what we were just talking about, the importance of education and our priorities. Thank you, Ken. I think we're all there. We've got another comment from Chris. The first step in changing how people view, oh, it just moved because another thing. Restarting from Chris. The first step in changing how people view their economic role is to stop identifying ourselves and others as by our work. That question, what do you do, is one we each need to not ask others when we first meet them or identify ourselves by our work. It would make it easier for people to take on new roles when their old job is obsolete. It's a pretty cool comment. I get that. And then we have a question from Isabel that's just asking Gabrielle for the book and the author in the chat. At that point, we are at the end of questions. Do you want to open it for one last question if anyone has a lingering one hanging out?
Sure, I would love that if that's possible. If anybody has anything, please, that they'd like to share or comment.
All right, we got one from Paul. What is your position on a universal base income? And I guess that'll be what we go out on.
I do believe that everybody has a right to be paid a fair living wage. I would rather see we'd rather see a change in what we consider to be our fair living wage, what we call a minimum wage, than necessarily look at a universal basic income. And the reason why I say that is cost of living differences exist across the board. Differences in family structure, differences in so many other aspects. We don't pay a fair living wage, nor do we evaluate what a fair living wage is based on geographic location. And I think this passes the buck to another policy when we haven't even been able to fix the policy that we already have in place. I remember years ago I was at a talk and I was speaking right after this. I don't know, as Undersecretary of Labor, not Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, excuse me. And we had a discussion off the side of the stage, and I asked him, you know, why is it that you don't? We keep on having the same discussion over and over every election cycle about the minimum wage and increasing the minimum wage. Why don't we bother to start evaluating it based on the cost of living in different areas in terms of establishing a minimum wage? And he said, because no one exercises their political clout long enough. And it's true, when you start to think about it, it just becomes a topic and then we forget about it and move on. And only if you happen to be the person living off of that wage, is it something that you want to feel really compelled to fight against? But unfortunately, if you're living on that wage, do you necessarily have the time to fight? The fight has to be with those that have the capacity, which oftentimes are those that are often distanced from the vulnerability itself. So it's incumbent upon us to really exercise our empathy.
Excellent.
Great. So on that note, Madhavi, do you want me to put in the Google poll right now?
Yes, please. Every time we do this, I'd really like to get your feedback. You know, this is my way of trying to be able to improve and also tailor this discussion that we're going to have to you. This wouldn't be possible if you didn't come. So I'm really hoping to see you next week too. Next week, we would talk about GDP specifically. It is a topic that many people have discussed, but I think when we start to see how it affects us and the decisions we make and how we've become an individual focused economy, which is really based on the measure of our economic system, that's how influential it is in terms of our cultural norms. I think it's really important. And then hopefully we can also then discuss how that affects our perception of other countries and why we have this false perception of development. We're measuring a circle based on the standard of a square. And not taking into consideration that different societies have different social norms. and unpaid work is work. It's just not measured in our GDP. So if unpaid work happens to be the norm in your society, it doesn't mean that the person should be valued less because they're unpaid. It means that we have a problem in our system, that we don't have an ability to see value for what it is, only what it is quantitatively evaluated as being. Again, going back to the proxy becoming the actual target.
Yeah. And so on that note, everyone, tomorrow, I hope to get out the next Zoom link for you, the recommended reading, and you'll also find the link to this Google poll. So if you have a minute and can fill out the Google poll, that'd be great. If you have any other questions or whatever, feel free to send those back to us through the email. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you all so much for coming.
And let's give a
thank you,
round of
Madhavi.
applause.
Thank you. Thank you all.
All right. Take care and have a good week.
And so at this moment, if you want to log off, that'd be awesome. Except for Madhavi. You hang around for a second.